really delighted already, first of all, to be with you, but with what I've heard, because there's a whole world of cultural and arts activity that I didn't really know very much about, since I spend almost exclusively all of my time in Europe, and have done for many years. I'm very grateful to the co-organizers of this event, the co-hosts. And as I was telling them already, I don't think I've ever been to an event that's been so fantastically well organized, ever, anywhere. And so hats off to you for that, and you must put that in the vote of thanks. The devil is in the details, and you've got a command of all the details, which is great. What I'm going to try and do, and I hope this will be helpful, is just set a little bit of context that might help us address those three vital questions that you've outlined for today, but also go beyond into some of those broader objectives that you have. And that context is the discourse and practice of cultural policy. And cultural policy is something that as a concept, as a discourse, as a practice, is rather underdeveloped in this country. There are historical reasons for that. That is not necessarily a failing of this country because there isn't a discourse of cultural policy. But I think now the time is very ripe for a robust discourse of cultural policy to emerge. And the prime makers of that are people like ourselves and yourselves, that is, who are active in the sector itself, because cultural policy is, after all, a way of seeing what we do and the significance of what we do. And that context is also linked up with an abiding concern that some people have had, and I certainly have had, which is to see some form of alliance building across this vast country, which is really a civilization state rather than a nation state. And what has struck me over the years is that there have been pockets of extremely vital activity going on in different cities, different places, but never any real movement that's pan-Indian. And I believe that what we do and how we do it and how we succeed as cultural actors can be very positively influenced by working with one voice. So what I'm going to do is just start by setting out in a nutshell, if you like, my vision of what cultural policy is, and then take you into a brief presentation of the work of Culture Action Europe, which is a pan-European platform of arts and culture creators, deliverers, activists of all kinds. And let's see where that takes us and whether that can be helpful for today's deliberations. So let me just start by looking at what cultural policy is. Any policy is an explicit and coherent system which has clearly defined aims, which has practical objectives, which are then measurable, and then concrete means, legislation, people, and money. And in the domain of culture, of course, a cultural policy is all of these things. It has aims, it has objectives, it has means. You could also say that social movements, political parties, educational institutions, businesses, private foundations can have a cultural policy position, each of them on their own. And the notion of cultural policy, if you look at the way the word was used and how it emerged, is essentially a French invention of a very particular moment in the late 50s when, under the leadership of André Malraux, who was appointed by President Charles de Gaulle to give a kind of new aspect to the glory of France through the propagation and improvement of the state of French culture. At that particular moment, a series of strands, ideological strands, came together. There was Malraux's thinking on the one hand, but there was also left-wing thinking that came out of the French resistance movement during the Second World War, which was very different. But the two combined to create a sense in France that, yes, we have a cultural policy, and that cultural policy is invested in the government of France and the Ministry of Culture. And this is something societal. It is not something imposed by the government, but something that everybody in France at that time thought was very important. And that concept of cultural policy was then grafted onto the thinking of UNESCO, because UNESCO is based in Paris, and French thinking was always influential in UNESCO, and it became internationalized. And so now, ever since the late 60s, UNESCO has also had a discourse on cultural policy. And let's just break down cultural policy a little bit and look at it in a way as a cascade. You have an overall vision of self-representation, and that overall vision of self-representation can lead to the setting of broad objectives for cultural affairs, and those broad objectives then lead to regulations and guidelines, and those regulations and guidelines in turn lead to what you could call steering mechanisms, which lead to strategy, from the strategy certain priorities. Those priorities are implemented through structures, procedures, institutions, and funds. And ideally, if you have a really good system, the results can be monitored, benchmarked, evaluated, and if necessary, redirected. Now, there is now in most of the countries of Western Europe, and also to some extent in the United States and Canada, an academic discipline of policy analysis. There's no degree in cultural policy analysis, but there are people who come from history, who come from cultural studies, sociology, anthropology, economics, who are now recognized as people who look at cultural policy. And in this field, obviously, what you're looking at is what the authorities do, what their agenda setting is, why they do certain things and not others, what are the choices that they're making, what are the outputs, the actual concrete outputs of those choices, and what are the outcomes, which are the less concretely measurable results, and what are the possible adaptations that, as an analyst, as an observer, you can suggest, and in the hope that sometimes you will be listened to. Outcomes. I talked about evaluating outcomes, and this is just both a question of value, and Rashmi introduced in her presentation that very important notion of the value of what we do. And that's something that is very important to look at in terms of cultural policy analysis. That is, what's being done, why, for whom, what are the ends, and are there positive goods that emerge for the greatest number of people? And then you have the instrumentality, which is the how. And something that's very striking that I've observed in India is that there have been any number of reviews of governmental policy making over the years. The Haxa report is the best known of those. But the ends are never really interrogated. The questions are always about the means. Is this agency efficient? Is this academy good or bad? But never any real questioning about whether, as a central government, the government of India has actually defined a cultural policy and whether that needs to be improved in any way. You also evaluate our outcomes in terms of equity of provision and recognition, democracy of access and representation, rights and voice. Those are all common themes in policy analysis in Western Europe and North America. And of course, this sounds in a way a little bit ideal when you apply it to India, because when you just think, and I won't go into the details, when you just think of the realities of caste and class in India, it's not so easy to, all of these things are very easy to advocate, but much harder to accomplish. Another point that I should make about cultural policy is that it is generally explicit, but it can be implicit in the sense that you may have an ideological trend, a social force, economic conditions that will in fact orient the way cultural affairs are conducted without there being any explicit definition by any authority that this is the cultural policy. And if I need to explain that further later on, I'll come back to it. I should say also that when we begin to look at the literature, we realize that there are basically two camps in cultural policy analysis. One is a more or less functional, direct, sociological camp, people looking at the institutions, looking at the budgets, looking at the decisions that are made. But then you also have the more critical view, and a typical statement that I've got up here on this screen is, I think, from a text by I'm just forgetting the name of an Australian writer, it will come back to me in a second, where together with one of his colleagues, he said, cultural policy is about the politics of culture in its the most general sense. It is about the clash of ideas, institutional struggles, and power relations in the production and circulation of symbolic meanings. A lot of that is going on in India today, but nobody will actually say this is an issue of cultural policy, because the phenomena are divided into sort of semantic camps is different. issues of cultural policy may be usefully considered from the point of view of a critical and communicative rationality, that these issues are not merely matters of instrumental reason. And another quote from the same writers, cultural policy is a site for the production of cultural citizens, with the cultural industries providing not only a ream of representations about oneself and others, but a series of rationales for particular types of conduct. And of course that applies very, very classically to Indian cinema and Bollywood. Cultural studies, the discipline which was founded by Stuart Hall, who was born many years ago next Saturday, and there's a celebration in London to celebrate that, comes essentially from Gramscian cultural analysis, that we need to analyze culture in relation to the social structure and its historical contingency, not just as a reflection of this structure and this history, but as a force that helps constitute the structure and shape the history. And if you think back to the freedom movement in India and all the cultural dimensions of that, and what people like us are doing in India today, we'll see that relationship very, very well. And of course, there are people not like us who are doing that in India today as well. And we can see the consequences. Culture is one of the principal sites where the divisions of capitalist industrial societies are established and contested. And I'd say, well, not just capitalist industrial societies. Culture is thus a terrain on which an unending struggle for meaning is taking place, in which subordinate groups attempt to resist the imposition of meanings which bear the interests of dominant groups. Culture is eminently ideological. And just to give you an idea of some of the issues that are sort of leading issues in cultural policies in the West, and these are issues of both ends and means. They're issues of higher purposes. What are we doing? Why are we doing them? But how are we doing them? And I think each of these can find a domain of application here in India just as much. Cultural expression, media and the public sphere, what's happening in the public sphere in interaction with the media, cultural capital and social exclusion, cultural representation and access to the means of cultural representation, cultural participation. That's a bit of a top-down idea that even in Europe is being contested, because the idea of giving access to a group that may be underprivileged, but you're giving access to that group of something that you have defined from the top down as being the culture that they should have. Cultural diversity, this is the issue of pluralism, but the reason I put it in scare quotes is that UNESCO has transformed that notion of the anthropological idea of cultural diversity into something a little different, which has to do with goods and services and international trade rules. And then the last domain is the cultural and creative industries. And so, as I said, in other words, both issues of ends and means. And finally, I think what has emerged very clearly in Europe and North America in terms of engaging, how the sector engages with cultural policy, is that there are these 5 key challenges. And when those challenges are addressed successfully, those movements in turn become successful. And I think I've got to the end of that one. And I'm going to segue into my second presentation. I'm using slides that I used many years ago when I was the president of Culture Action Europe to just give you an idea of what this pan-European organization actually does and what it is and what it does. It's an umbrella organization across the EU, so your organization has to be in a country that is a member of the EU. And at the time, Culture Action Europe had very active UK members, who of course now would no longer be members. Cultural organizations and associations, cultural networks, and also individuals. It was founded in 1992 in response to an article in one of the European treaties that gave the European Union some kind of competence in the field of culture. It was limited competence and remains limited competence, but it was introduced to enable cultural workers in the EU, and you notice that term cultural operators. That's the EU term. That's what's used in the EU. It sounds a bit odd, but it also comes from the French. You can say in French, opérateur culturel, and it sounds okay. Saying it in English is a bit odd, but that's the term has stuck. It's part of EU jargon. And obviously the purpose of this is that since there is a competence, there's a budget, and if you're active and if you have an alliance and you can speak with one voice, you get more funding. The members in 2007, it's probably much more than this now. You can see how the membership was made up, and it is a cross-disciplinary membership of institutions active in both arts creation and arts delivery, as well as in research, information, training, policy analysis, and advocacy. And the interesting thing here, of course, is that Godrej Culture Lab, ACRI, they are doing research, information, training, and advocacy. And the question is, and there are in Europe, of course, there are French organizations, German organizations, Danish organizations, you name it, doing the same kind of work. Why is it that they have seen some interest in doing this collectively? And there's definitely an interest in doing this collectively. The funding in 2004, you can see how large the EU subvention was, and the EU subvention was given because obviously for the EU officials themselves and the politicians, it was easier to be, it was very important to have a relationship with an organization like this, and they were willing to pay for it. Members' fees, and then other was contributions from private foundations and some corporate donors. The mission of Cultural Action Europe was these three things, and these are words I'm not going to dwell upon because these are things we've heard already from our co-hosts. It's doing very similar sorts of things, except at a collective level. In particular, formulating here policy positions and presenting them to EU institutions, notably the European Parliament. And in relation to the European Parliament, it is a platform for providing information on and access to cultural networks and NGOs, expressing the views and aspirations of the sector, offering expertise like, oh, I have to speak on the subject in next week, can you write my speech? That's the sort of expertise that Culture Action Europe actually offers to individual MEPs. Its activities have included launching campaigns for more funding from EU budgets, raising the voice of the sector, and a last but very important point, because none of the members of Culture Action Europe wanted to be within a fortress Europe, is advocating the importance of cultural work with other European as well as world organizations and with national governments as well. And this is going to close with, this bit is going to close with just 5 key advocacy points. And these are the advocacy points that I was plugging on behalf of the organization about 12 years ago. The first point is a framework of structured dialogue. We wanted that to exist. We wanted, obviously, specific actions in favor of mobility across the different countries of Europe. We wanted to monitor the cultural dimensions of all policy areas, because there is a culture budget for the EU, but there are lots of other areas like local development, health, social security, where there are cultural components. Provide access funding for third country. That's another quaint EU term which refers to anything that's not the EU. If you're other than the EU, you're a third country. And increase the budget of the EU culture program. It was something like 10 cents per person per year, if you counted the population of the EU. And we said, let's increase it tenfold and take it to 70. So it was at all levels an advocacy platform. And the question is, and I'm going to close with a few slides on this, can we envisage, should we envisage something similar in India? And the context in India, as I've written about it, and perhaps things have changed a little bit, but I don't think very much, is that there's vibrant cultural expression in India, but it doesn't seem as if the creators and actors and operators in the sector actually see themselves as a sector. Central state governments, maybe there are a couple of exceptions. I spent some time in Goa, and I found Goa to be an exception. There was a very clearly defined cultural policy in Goa that was being applied, but elsewhere, no. And hence the term to talk about cultural policy in India is a bit of a contradiction. It's in fact an oxymoron, and that's the term I used for the article that Rashmi had read. To continue with the context here in India, there is recognition, patronage, and funding to be sure, but it seems to me that this is driven entirely or almost entirely by the upper caste high culture canon, whether it's the government or the private sector. There is also a politics of culture, as I've already observed, but this is not really seen as a question of cultural policy. And a few scholars do analyze cultural processes in this country, and I've learned from the work of several of them and will cite them in a minute, but there's no actual discipline of cultural policy studies. And I think that if there was one somewhere in the country, this would make a huge difference. And one of the scholars that I wanted to cite for you, and this is from a text written by Ashish Rajadhaksha, who's a film scholar, and several of his colleagues, which he did for the Asia-Europe Foundation. I think it was about 7, 8 years ago. And this is Ashish's take on cultural policy. And as a result of that, what we see in India is that there is the situation that you see on this slide, which I'll let you read for yourselves and take a breath and perhaps a bit of water. Anita Cherian is one of the people who's written very intelligently about culture, and I think she's a sociologist. And an article of hers several years ago put the finger on several key points. And the one that I would foreground here is in all of the fantastic work that the Indian state has put in to modernize this country, culture has been understood as both the locus of the traditional and as the imagined foundation of a social solidarity that makes the modern state possible. And there was a bit of a consensus around that for many years, the Nehruvian consensus, which has now been broken, but although the consensus itself has been broken, the issue that there is now a very lively debate doesn't seem to be as taken on as sort of centrally as it might have been. And then the third point that Anita Cherian has made, which is something that we've been observing for a number of years, is that particular forms, here she cites Bharatanatyam, but there has been a kind of nationalization of certain aspects of Indian culture that have been made into icons of the nation and icons of the cultural antiquity of the nation. And you see that in a lot of cultural exchanges, and a lot of what is performed abroad as representative of India. And of course other countries have forms that they think are, that the government at least thinks is representative of them. And those tend to be very stereotyped. This brings to mind, and since I have a little bit of time, I'll digress a bit and share with you something that I saw and heard in the UK maybe 15 years ago, where the representative to a culture conference in the UK of the Institut Français, of the French Institute, the French cultural representation, at a conference which was international, but where the tone was one of pluralism, that we all now have heterogeneous societies and that our definitions of culture are not homogeneous and uniform. The representative of France made a very special point of saying, our work at the French Institute is to present culture in France, not the culture of France. And that was very telling, because what he was saying there is, hey, you guys in Britain, you're not the only ones who have a multicultural, plural society. And of course, there was a bit of a white lie there, because the extent to which multiplicity and variety are accepted in France is much less than is the case in the UK. But these ways in which countries are representing themselves, and the authorities of those countries are representing themselves, and by extension, the artists and the cultural policy actors of those countries are representing themselves, has shifted subtly in recent years, which comes back to the question of, here we have in this room an extremely dynamic group of people representing a range of contemporary activities. Do these activities get represented abroad as being typical of what's happening in India today? No, obviously not. So there is a problem there. And so what I would see in my dreams, as it were, the dream that I would have, is that there might be an alliance of creatives and operators in all fields of cultural creation, preservation, and delivery. And some of the fields are here, and these are the fields that we've seen already reviewed, would be constituted to overcome certain very clearly observable constraints on the Indian scene, that government funding is very limited. It is everywhere in the world, but it's probably even more limited here. The private and corporate philanthropy is also limited, but it has progressed quite remarkably in recent years in India. That the distribution of funding is never driven by any coherent policy vision, although quite clearly the organizations that you represent have a policy, each of you, and you have a coherent vision, but there isn't anything overarching, and that human resources are very limited. There's just simply not enough professional clout in the sector. I see some people in the room who represent the opposite of that. For example, Pooja and the work that you've done, that's very professional work, and at the highest level. But there's need to be much more of that. And what we see also, that the nature, the demand for cultural services across the country has increased dramatically with economic trends post-liberalization in India, but that the nature of that demand has changed completely. And many of our cultural institutions in India are completely out of sync with that change. That change has been brought about by both growing affluence and rising cultural awareness, and that growing affluence going together with rising cultural awareness is historically a pattern that you can observe certainly in Western Europe and North America, where in those countries the emergence of an educated middle class has increased the awareness of culture, not just as entertainment, but as a way of shaping and life and imagining the future. There's some key preliminary questions. It's not the first time in India that these issues are being addressed, and we need to ask ourselves, have lessons that have been drawn earlier, have those lessons been applied? Have they even been adequate? And to some extent, as I said earlier, I think many of the questions have been too limited. They've been about the how and not about the what. And we need to ask the questions about the what. And in terms of building an alliance, is there the will and capacity today? And if the answer to that is positive, then this is what I would see emerging: a multi-stakeholder platform that addresses these sorts of questions, that designs what has to be a new process of reflection and agenda setting, and imagines a blueprint for some kind of permanent civil society, arts, and cultural platform. And this alliance would develop both visions and practical plans in a joined-up way that combines the energies of both public and private sector actors. And so I'll leave you with that possibility. The question that occurred to me as I was listening to the two presentations this morning is, perhaps we don't actually need an alliance, something that's formally constituted as such, but we need a mushrooming of initiatives such as yours. So maybe the same result can be achieved through the emergence of culture lab and ACRI type institutions in all of the cities of the country. That might be a way forward. But I'm not a Jacobin, but I'm a bit of a federalist. So I always like to see central institutions and you know, not too formal, certainly not bureaucratic, certainly not top down. But I think that the time is ripe for something like this to emerge. And I hope that those remarks that I've shared with you have been of some use. And I look forward to the rest of the day, which is going to be very exciting. Thank you very much. And I think there was a last slide on which I had, yes, I'd put my contact details because I'm not carrying very many visiting cards. And so if anybody's interested, I use my American University of Paris address. So it's risar@aup.edu. And that is my French telephone number, mobile number, and WhatsApp on which I can be reached. Thank you very much.